there are all sorts of issues related to what's just around the barns on the farm that may lead to outbreaks.
Welcome, everybody, to the Swine Canada podcast show. I am Dan Columbus, and I will be your host for today's episode. And we have a returning guest today, so welcome back to Dr. Jean-Pierre Vaillancourt. So thank you again for joining us and gracing us with your presence and knowledge once again.
Well, nice being here with you.
Just because, like always, people might not know who you are, and they might not have listened to the last episode. So we'll start, like we always do, with you introducing yourself and giving us a little bit of background.
All right. Well, I'm a vet. I got my DVM at the University of Montreal. After that, I did a master's degree in population medicine. It was actually swine issues. I was working on pneumonia at the time. It was a big deal. Now we're way in the 20th century, in the 80s. After that, I did my PhD with Al Lehman, Gary Dial, Will Marsh, people. I think that if you're in the swine business, you know who they are. And so I worked on pre-weaning mortality, but for all sorts of reasons, I ended up going on the poultry side, where my family has been involved. And so for the past 30 plus years, I've been mainly focusing on poultry, but because I have an interest in biosecurity, once in a while I go back on the swine side because there are some challenges there as well.
Yeah.
The Nutrition Athena, Shakespeare Mill, Farmhouse, and Nutrition Partners Nutrition Group offer the full range of nutritional product based on extensive research and developments, and a solid team of experts all across Canada. Our objective is to provide cost-effective solutions, innovation, and support to producer from the entire Canadian swine industry.
I know we talked about biosecurity a little bit on your last time, so we can expand on that this time. And, you mentioned poultry, and I think, you suggested that there's things that we can learn from poultry when you kind of filled out the information of what you want to talk about today. So, with the emerging diseases and the threat of African swine fever, maybe that's a good place to start, is just, what's going on maybe in the poultry world, what's going on in the pig world, how do we learn from each other?
Yeah, well, of course, the current challenge that we have in poultry is highly pathogenic avian influenza. And what we're discovering, like in the United States, the vast majority, like 85% of the outbreaks, they are like isolated infections. Like it's not necessarily going farm to farm. It's just that we have a situation with a very infectious agent that is now pandemic, is worldwide, and it is contaminating the environment. And when you think about African swine fever, for example, it's not the same situation, of course. Thankfully, we don't have it. But if we would ever have that pathogen, what's worst about it is that it's extremely resistant in the environment. And what we discover in poultry is that, very often the problem is we drag the pathogen that is nearby into the barn, and then we get the birds infected. There are all sorts of issues related to what's just around the barns on the farm that may lead to outbreaks. And then, of course, in swine, you have diseases like PRRS where it's airborne, and all the farms around a particular farm you're trying to protect, well, they may play a role. So what's happening, and we see it a lot in poultry with climate change, we have a lot of these emerging pathogens showing up because wildlife, waterfowl and all that, they're they're changing their behaviors. We have some migrating birds that have elected no longer to migrate, for example. And that's a bit of a game changer. Or they will go where they didn't used to go, and they'll be in contact with other birds, and all that may lead to a contamination of the resident wildlife, and that is changing a lot how we're looking at how to protect poultry farms. And I think in swine, that's also a consideration, right? We have been looking at the environment all around, and because of PRRS in particular. But now we have countries that are going to say, wait a second, we cannot let people build farms or add facilities wherever they want. That's always been a bit the case because of environmental laws. But now they are factoring in the proximity to other farms. And not only that, in Europe right now, they're going further. They're discovering, for example, with HiPath AI, that there's some regions where the setup, the diversity of, I would say, the commercial biomass, right, is such that it favors outbreaks. And now they're even thinking of saying, well, we might have to tell growers, well, if you want to keep producing, you're going to have to produce something else. Okay, and I mean that's a big deal. And they are even in poultry. It's easier to do, of course, than in swine. But to say, well, for a period of time in the year when we're more at risk, you're going to have to cut down or not produce or keep the animals inside. There's also stuff like that we've been discussing for a while, but now it's getting really fast because now they're losing. I mean, it's billions of euros that are there, and I think the motivation is to reconsider, the commercial industries, animal industries, looking at where they are, how they should grow, all of that. So I think we may be looking at a paradigm shift eventually, in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that over there. In Canada, we probably have a much varied situation I can see because, out in the prairies, we have the advantage of a lot of space between our facilities and that, whereas maybe in Southern Ontario, not so much, right?
Yeah, that plays a role. At the same time, you have a lot of wind in the west.
That's true.
Yeah, and as I said, I mean, this climate change thing is real, and the impact is not subtle, and we're just learning. We're just discovering what that might bring to us, and so yes, the Western Canada has advantages. At the same time, okay, we're thinking, for example, the African swine fever. Okay, with one big consideration, if it happens, like a worst case scenario, would be wild hogs would eventually get contaminated. Let's say in the United States, okay, where we think there's about 5 million of them roaming around, mainly in the South. But those who are looking at these animals have noticed that they're migrating north, okay? And quite frankly, they're migrating north towards Western Canada, okay? In particular, I mean, because there's, you have Montana and the Dakotas and all these places. Well, they're kind of nice places for these type of animals. And as we have a different climate, because I mean, I'm not kidding. Yesterday, I could wash my car outside in a t-shirt. It was 16 degrees. Okay, I sent pictures to my brother who is in Quebec City. There they still have snow. We have no snow here right now, essentially in Montreal. So that kind of situation might favor movement of wildlife. Actually, not only might, will, and is having impacts like that. So hopefully it won't get that bad that we're going to have a contamination of with African swine fever. But if we do, I mean, I have been involved with the European situation. I was on an emergency committee there for the French when they ended up with the problem at their border with Belgium and now with Italy. And it's not as simple as saying, well, we should just kill them all, get rid of these wild animals. It's first of all, you don't have social acceptability. People are saying, hey, wait a second, you cannot do that. And second, they're very tough to very bright animals, and it's very difficult to eradicate, these types of animals. So, even if Western Canada, you're right, you have some advantages, but at the same time, you're not New Zealand. You're not on an island. Okay.
No. Yeah, we have the space between the facilities, but we still, like you said, we have the other problems like with the wildlife and stuff like that. I know that the wild boar thing is definitely an issue up here, right? They've made that migration and they are establishing themselves.
Sure, but see, look, you have space, but is it possible for somebody, a business person, to say, I'm going to build a big swine farm within a kilometer of another swine farm? Is it legal? And I can tell you that in poultry, they can do it. They did. And we had a situation in Ontario when we could predict that they had grandparents stuck. We're talking at the top almost of the pyramid for turkey production. They were trying to protect that, but somebody could build a breeder farm within 800 meters with the prevailing winds going towards that breeding stock, that those highly valued turkeys. And sure enough, in 2015 or so, the breeders got infected with hypatia, and then the grandparent stock got hit as well. And the reason for it is because it was legal to build. There's no regulations, and the industry is not regulating that, because I assume, the industry could say, hey, we're going to lobby the government, or we're going to put something in place so that we have a little bit of a structure about how we're going to install new facilities or things like that. The Italians are doing it. In New Zealand or Australia, they're doing it as well. But it's very limited. And I think we need to really talk about that and consider that.
Yeah, I think the opposition might come more. I'm not sure of the legalities of it, but the opposition might come more from the people around you saying, we don't want another pig barn, or we don't want another. I think that's usually what ends up happening nowadays, is that it's whatever town you're trying to build near or whatever, that kind of comes back and says.
So that and the environment, and that's fair enough. That's okay. But my point is that right now we don't have in place what's needed in Canada to really address that kind of issue. We need to really have a solid discussion. And when I say we, I'm not a decision maker, right? I'm just a university professor. But the decision makers, those who have the investments, they really need to think about that.
Yeah. So you touched on, some of the similarities of the issues that we're seeing with poultry and with swine, right? So I guess then, are there any major successes or maybe failures that have happened in the poultry side of that we can learn about, or from, in order to make sure that the same situation doesn't happen in pigs?
Well, yeah. I think if you look at regional biosecurity, I think I think the West is a bit like United States in poultry. There's a lot of integration, and what has been a fairly good success there, in particular, like in North Carolina, is the integrators are talking to one another. They allow their veterinarians to share information. As a matter of fact, I was so used to that. I didn't realize when I arrived back in Canada in 2004, I was starting I was proposing things. Then they stopped me. They say, you're going to lose your practice license, okay? Because you're trying to share information that you cannot share in Canada. And that is a big problem, okay? Confidentiality in Canada, we take that extremely seriously. We're almost, it's almost pathological in some ways, okay? What I mean by that is that I agree with protecting data, personal information, and all that. And I understand that companies, farmers, don't want to just share everything with everybody. That's fair. But when you're facing a disease that has an impact on a regional basis, if you don't address it by communicating at a regional level, that disease will thank you because it will take advantage of your lack of communication. Because whether it's Hypath AI, African swine fever, you do not control these diseases with just disinfectants, okay? That's not how you do that, is by communicating. And I've seen a situation, for example, in North Carolina, where they had mycoplasmosis was becoming a problem. And they worked together, asking the vets to share critical information about location, where there was an issue, so that we could discuss and use the technologies that we have today, like we're doing right now, so that we didn't have to all move to one place to talk, but go online, decide what are we going to do with this particular situation, and not blaming anybody, just saying, okay, what can we do so that it stays there, so that we can extinguish this fire and prevent it from spreading elsewhere. So that communication, on top of having some kind of rules about how you can set up new facilities and all that, I think that is something important. The communication bit, we have experience in poultry as far as being able to contain important diseases. And I don't know, I know that, for example, Bob Morrison had started he has something there in Minnesota that is still on. They call it the Morrison something, I don't recall exactly, but where they share data, they share information, and I think we need to push in that direction and make sure that that we gather what is needed, because it's nice to get data, but sometimes you can gather too much information, you get too much white noise, and then it loses its impact. So it's important to have companies, growers agree to share some key information for some specific conditions in order to be able to contain that quickly.
Yeah, it's like you said, the lack of the communication is what's going to end up hurting us. And what you're keeping it secret or proprietary or whatever, but that only ends up hurting the industry if you're not communicating and this gets out of control.
Well, yeah, and we have some examples of that. We had many, many years ago in the 90s. Actually, the reason why I ended up in North Carolina is because there was this disease that they used to call spiking mortality, because it was a syndrome still is, we identified over 10 pathogens that could, if you had the right cocktail, could recreate the syndrome. And we're talking in meat birds up to 96% mortality. Okay, so it's not like a little thing. And the few animals that can survive do not grow. So that was very spectacular. Well, the first company that saw this, they were in another state than North Carolina, and their reaction was, well, in our business, we're trying to sell pulse, to other people, in other states. So what we'll do is we'll get a researcher to help us produce these spiking mortality-free birds so that we can get the market, right? Because we'll say, all right, well, that didn't work. And the disease, the syndrome spread. And by the 95, 96, they had spent over $250 million trying to contain this situation. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that people were not talking and were not sharing key information. So we had long delays in understanding how this thing was moving around, how it was, and that's another good example of a disease where we knew that chickens would not have it, but turkeys had it. And so at one point, some integrators decided to switch production from turkey to poultry on some key farms. So the turkey production went down in the state. And after they had reduced the production by about 35%, 40%, the syndrome went away. Okay. It went away. And from the beginning, 5-6 years before that, the big emphasis was biosecurity. So they were putting a lot of, traditional biosecurity, on-farm biosecurity. And that's very important. Don't get me wrong. Very important. But the fact was that syndrome was still popping up. And at one point, when we reduced the overall turkey biomass in this given region, all of a sudden, poof, the syndrome, the severe part of the syndrome just disappeared. Okay? So this regional thing is something we need to look into. And we cannot do it unless we share information,
Yeah. Communication is going to be key.
Yeah.
So the other thing that you mentioned, in the little survey we sent before this is, we can use all the AI and the sensors and everything that we want, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the people, right, that outline the success.
That's the other thing, we talking about communication was talking about people, essentially. So yes, AI is going to move in and be a big thing for us, I believe, in animal production. I'm actually getting into this. It's really interesting. In my department, we created and just got, and I'm in clinical sciences, we just got a professor for AI. That's the guy's job, working on AI. So that's very important. And we have sensors and we have technologies, and we're trying to make a lot of stuff. Is it proof? Okay. And it's not the right term. Maybe I should, but you get what I mean. You want people to, even if you don't you really mean to make a mistake, you make mistake. You forget things. You're not paying attention to something. So one things we can do, for example, is we could have, like, as you enter a barn, you open the door, you have to close it, and you have to follow some steps before the door giving you access to the pigs can unlock, for example. Okay, that's cool. And we can easily get there because the technologies for this are like decades old, right? It's not anything, cutting edge. But the big problem is, as long as we have people, and we need people, it would be important to focus on them, and that's been neglected. And I realized that because when I was over the past few years, when we discovered that we often had a lack of compliance for classic biosecurity, and that's true in everyday anybody, right? If you're a parent and you're trying to convince your kids to wash their hands before they go eat, it's not a simple thing. You need to repeat. You need to motivate them and all that. Same thing for employees, technicians coming in a farm, having to perform some tasks that are really a pain because it delays doing what they want to do. Okay. So obviously you need to work on having ways of applying biosecurity that is simple, that is easy to do in all this. That's because it's human nature. If it's too complicated, we'll find a way around. So that's the first thing. Now, all this being said, in industries other than swine and poultry, if you look at other types of industries, you'll discover that for the many years now, they're looking at people's emotional intelligence as a way to improve the employee's performance in terms of compliance. Imagine you are working for NASA and your job is to build the rocket, to ship that up. You cannot just wing it and say, well, we think we got all the bolts, screws in properly. You want to make sure. And so you want to have good technicians. You want to have people who are professionals. But it's important to look at this emotional intelligence because we have more and more information showing that it's associated with compliance, not only biosecurity, but all compliance in just about anything. And that requires a couple. And the good news about this, by the way, is that we have like the IQ intelligence, like the raw intelligence we may have, but you have what you got, okay? And let's hope for the best there. The emotional intelligence is something you can actually grow. You can actually improve. And industrial psychologists are telling us there are ways to work on people to increase their emotional intelligence, their self-awareness, their social skills and all that will actually favor compliance for what you want them to do. And as long as you're going to have people involved in swine production, it would be important to work on that. But it's neglected. People have, and I know people in industry will say, well, look, a lot of employees, they're minimal wage. They're often foreigners. They come in for 6 months, then they leave. We have a turnover. Do you actually expect us to spend a lot of time and money on improving the emotional intelligence of people? That we're not talking people paid $250,000 a year here, it's really low tech and shoveling manure, that kind of stuff. But and I did ask that question to industrial psychologists. They say, well, sure, it's the same thing for a lot of companies. They have like, let's call them lower level job type employees. These people, when it comes to biosecurity, they're probably much more important than the CEO, right? The CEO will stay in his office. The guy shoveling manure, well, if he doesn't do the biosecurity on farm properly, he can really be at the origin of a big problem. And so the good news is it's not necessarily expensive, but it requires putting in place a few things. And one of them is providing feedback, okay? Companies like Cargill, for example, they put a lot of emphasis on that. They're trying to provide daily feedback to employees because they say, sure, people want to be paid. And if you offer them as an incentive some more money, for example, they'll be very happy. But quite frankly, what they want often more than anything else is feedback, to be told if they're doing things right. And if it's not right, what they could do to improve. And if you do these things properly, then it becomes very positive. It's the idea is not to punish. At one point, you may have to. You have somebody who's really not the right person for the right job. At one point you need to do. But by and large, if you provide good feedback, you get your managers. You try to increase the emotional intelligence of your managers. You're going to have overall an impact on all the other employees. And that's something that they have discovered working in other businesses. And since people are people, whether they are working on building a car or working on a farm, why would we, treat them differently? So that is something that we need to consider, and that's another neglected thing. But when we look at swine or poultry production.
Yeah, it's just, when they say they don't want to invest in it, it's like, well, what is the cost of an outbreak if somebody breaks that, right? And taking that into account, that it was, well, as soon as you said that, that's what I was thinking. When it comes to emotional intelligence, and I admittedly, because I'm not a psychologist, it seems like a very broad term. Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm wondering if there's like specific aspects of emotional intelligence that are more key to this compliance and the employee's willingness to do what they need to do than other aspects.
Yeah. They define this emotional intelligence as the ability to identify your own emotions and the emotions of others, to self-motivate yourself. And to know how to monitor your emotions and people's emotions around you in a way. So it has to do with self-awareness, knowing what affects you. What are your triggers? What are your relationship patterns? How do you self-manage yourself? Learning, adopting strategies to self-regulate yourself. Some people, they lose it quite quickly. Others, they are much more in control. Relationship management is a big thing. There are a lot of skills getting people to go into conflict resolution, getting support. But we're not talking like big time hockey players asking for help because they're taking drugs here. We're talking addressing people's issues by providing an environment and having people helping them to have a better understanding of what they're doing, why they're doing it, why they need to work as a team. A lot of the whys have to be understood because we're dealing with adults. We're not dealing with kids. You have a 5-year-old, you're going to say, I ask you to wash your hands because I'm telling you, and that's the way it is. Yeah. Okay. But if you have a 50-year-old and you're insisting that they do something, and the more that person has experience in the field, the more they have their own perception of what should be done or not done. And so it's important to be able to explain the whys, but also to provide them with an environment, with people who will help them develop this management of their emotions, of their and their understanding of others, because all that plays a role per se when it comes to and it's been associated with compliance when there's a requirement by a company, for example. So we're just starting to look at it for biosecurity, but the psychologists talking to us are saying there's no reason why you will not find that you have a tremendous impact there, because we find it elsewhere. And whether you wash your hands because you're in a barn, or you wash your hands because you work in a big restaurant, it's the same idea. Okay, it's the same action, and so in practice, how is that going to work out? How would we have like an integrated company hire, for example, an industrial psychologist to help set up some workshops or stuff like that, and propose some that kind of stuff, and what kind of follow up is needed and all this. It's too soon to tell. But the take home message I got from these psychologists, because before getting into this and actually applying to get funds to look into that, I said, am I going to discover that it's something really neat, but that it's like academic, right? Academically, it's great, but in practice, nobody will want to get into that. And they say, no. You're going to realize that the reason why it works in other businesses, in banks, for example, and stuff like that, the banks will often hire somebody and get them to take some tests, and these tests, psychological tests, are designed so that they can better understand these people, not to decide whether they should employ them or not, but more so that they can assign them to the right job and determine how they're going to get them to grow in their business. And so this is something that we need to work on in animal production. It's just starting. We're trying to get the data, hopefully over the next few months. And what we propose to do is not only to identify people who are complying, those who are not, and then testing them to determine their emotional intelligence, but we're proposing to intervene. We're saying we're going to, based on their emotional intelligence, based on the fact that we know that they comply or not, okay, because we'll be able to gather data on that, we're going to custom design a series of different workshops, approaches, so that we can try to have an impact on them, and then monitor that to see how successful we are. Okay, and what we're proposing is stuff that is not very expensive to do, because we know that if you propose something that has no chance of being adopted, as I said, then we're back into some kind of academic pursuit, and I have no interest in that.
Yeah, I mean, it all makes sense to me, but like you said, it's in the infancy, so it'll be interesting to see what you find. And I think that means we're going to have you on again.
That'll be good, and I've been looking forward to that. And because in academia, whether we succeed or fail, in both cases, we can get something out of it, right? So at this stage in my career, I don't mind talking about failures. I mean,
Yeah. We tend to not like the failures as much as not in academia, but I'll say, well, we'll have you on to talk about the success or the failure, depending on what it is, because I think I know I personally would like to know, what you find in this, and I'm sure the listeners would too.
It's time for our famous three.
Kind of at the end of our time that we like to go for. I'm not going to ask you the three questions. I told you that before, just because you've already been on. So if people want your book recommendations, they can go to your previous episode. But I will ask you before I let you go, just for a take-home message for our listeners.
Well, take-home message would be to think about how many ways people could communicate in a way that's acceptable and that could bring something to them in terms of ability to better manage infectious diseases. For in our case, that's the main thing. Second, I think that when you're looking at biosecurity, we need to keep an open mind. A lot of the basic measures of biosecurity are found in texts that are over 2,000 years old. I think I mentioned that before. In Deuteronomy, in the Old Testament, you have a lot of some basic biosecurity thing. And that was written 2,600 years ago. Okay. In Leviticus, that's a text published 2,400 years ago. Well, not published, but at least written 2,400 years ago. And you find what we're trying to do on farms. And yet today, in 2024, we're still looking at ways to make sure that people will follow these measures, in terms of removing sources of contamination, bringing separation between healthy animals and sources of contamination. We're still trying to do that. I'm reminded of a molecular biologist who was listening to me, and at one point she raised her hand. She was in Guelph, and she said, JP, are you telling me that you guys in the field are still trying to figure out how to get people to put on coveralls and wash their hands? And I said, you darn, but yeah, that's part of what we're still trying to do. So that basic stuff is often not done. If you think it's done well on your farm, maybe it's because you're alone on that farm and you're doing it well. But if you have employees, I would say do not assume. Do not assume, and focus on good communication with these people. That's one great way of improving compliance on farms. And at the regional level, start thinking about what you'll be willing to share for some key diseases in order to help make sure it doesn't get to you, or if it's in your farm, it doesn't go anywhere else.
Yeah, no, great message. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on again. I'm looking forward to the next time because I'm sure you'll be back. So just thank you for coming on and joining us once again.
More than welcome.